Welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. Before we get started, I would like to review a few features available to you as an attendee. At the lower left-hand side, you will find the audio settings dropdown. You can select your speakers and adjust your volume here. At the bottom center, you will see the Q&A button. Select this icon to submit your questions to our panelists to review and respond throughout the event. With these features reviewed, I would like to welcome Loyola University Chicago's Provost and Chief Academic Officer, Margaret Callahan.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today as we resume a series of scholarly conversations marking Loyola University Chicago's 150th anniversary as Chicago's Jesuit University. I am Margaret Callahan. It is my honor to serve as Provost and Chief Academic Officer for this extraordinary university as we fulfill our mission of education, inquiry, and service. This fall marks our return to our campuses, and we also continue to reach out to our larger community to share the expertise and insight of our faculty in robust discussion and debate. In the 150 Scholars Lecture Series, we bring together our most accomplished faculty and scholars in conversation around compelling issues. In this afternoon's program, we return to the fundamental questions at the heart of Jesuit mission. What is the meaning and role of Catholic higher education in the 21st century? How do our distinctive values guide our teaching and our research? What is the relationship between scientific and spiritual knowing? This installment of our 150 Scholars Series is centered in Loyola's Hanks Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage. Approaching its 15th anniversary, the Hanks Center has become a leading center for scholarship, debate, and engagement around the Catholic intellectual tradition as it is reflected in the arts, in sciences, in social justice, and public policy. We are excited to hear from a distinguished group of Loyola scholars who will share their perspectives on the philosophy and approach of Catholic higher education and the ongoing conversation between faith and reason. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael P. Murphy, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Theology and Director of the Hanks Center, who will moderate what promises to be an illuminating discussion. Michael?
Thank you very much, Provost Callahan, and really a delight to see you once again. I'm so sorry I cleared my throat with my mute button off, but maybe things can't be too perfect in our lives. So thanks again, and really good afternoon to everybody assembled here on our Zoomcast. Kind greetings, really, and I pray that all are in good health and spirits. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hanks Center here at Loyola. And I suppose here is a relative term, as I'm coming to you live, not from Loyola, but from my home just outside of Chicago, thanks to the wonders of digital technology. And on behalf of our Hanks Center staff, our office manager, Patty Delgado, our graduate assistant, Adam High, and on behalf again of our co-hosts, Provost Callahan and Vice President of Mission Integration, Janet Sisler, I offer you another level of heartfelt greeting and welcome. My gratitude is to them both and to their Cracker Jack teams for helping to get our much anticipated Nexus launch from farm to table. We are thrilled that we could share the essays from this inaugural issue under the auspices of the 150 Scholars Series. This kind of work is the lifeblood of the university, and we are just delighted to present it to readers of goodwill everywhere so as to share needed insight and to engender constructive conversation. A final thank you is always reserved for Joan and Bill Hank and their family, whose generous endowment funds our many diverse endeavors. This year, as Provost Callahan mentioned, we celebrate 15 eventful years here at the center. And so around here, around the center, it is both an Ignatian year and a Hank year. Thank you, Hanks. First, a brief word about Nexus, and then we'll dig in. Nexus Conversations on the Catholic Intellectual Tradition is a digital age journal that amplifies and publishes scholarly dialogue taking place in the Hank Center, whether in symposia and conference proceedings, or in the research of its several faculty working groups. Cultivating the Jesuit principle of finding God in all things, Nexus fosters a wide scope of interdisciplinary scholarship in order to be a leavening to the scholarly community here at Loyola, but also to the church, of course, and to our local, national, and international colleagues, partners, and audience. Nexus is published annually by the Hank Center. Our next issue will focus on restorative justice and the abolition of the death penalty. And future issues will take up Catholicism and digital media, the future of the Catholic literary and artistic tradition, and forays into science, religion, and the technocratic paradigm. Please check the link in the chat for more information about Nexus and to read the superb essays from the first volume. I salute each of the contributors by name here, Loyola scholars all. Dr. Richard Kim, Dr. Jeffrey J. Fisher, Dr. Shu Ying Wong, Dr. James G. Murphy of the Society of Jesus, Dr. Avery Muriel Smith, Dr. Marcella Lin, Dr. Naomi Fisher, Dr. Joe Vukov. And special lauds to our new Director of Catholic Studies, Dr. Naomi Fisher, and Mr. Andrew Crema, who served as volume editors for the inaugural. Well done, one and all. Now to our event. I think you might remember that. In 1990, St. John Paul II proposed in the landmark Apostolic Constitution, Ex Corde Ecclesiae, quote, that a Catholic university unites, quote, the search for the truth with the certainty of already knowing the fount of truth. 31 years later, what are the implications and challenges of this Constitution for Catholic higher education, for teachers, researchers, thinkers, and students in Catholic universities? Quo vadis, Catholic higher ed? Certainly, so much has been written about Ex Corde, and this is a long conversation, whether unfolding in the Journal of Catholic Higher Education, Jesuit Studies in Higher Education, those two great journals, or in the many monographs and collected volumes that take up Ex Corde's themes by scholars, or in the many debates about the document and the state of Catholic higher ed that have unfolded and unfold still in magazines like America and First Things, Commonweal and Crisis, that scope there. And not to mention the ACCU studies and other specialized studies that review, all this and the work that comes out of Rome as well, the congregations there. So many conversations. But what you have to what we have before us today is a series of compelling, fresh takes on Ex Corde. And it's most interesting to note at least two things about the essays. First, with the exception of one contributor, all essays were written by philosophers, a fact that would no doubt please the philosopher Karo Wotia and his unique brand of Thomist phenomenological personalism. Second, with the exception of one contributor, these are next generation writers, and all were raised and trained in a decidedly post-conciliar setting. This is no small thing, as the reception of Ex Corde Ecclesiae in the 1990s, especially in the US, was fraught with controversy. To a degree unprecedented, so many in the Catholic Academy in the US were profoundly alienated by Roman curial authority and American bishops who were perceived to have overstepped their scholarly expertise in their implementation of the general and transitional norms articulated in the document. For Jesuit theologian Michael Buckley, of blessed memory, these interventions were, quote, quite troubling and fed into, quote, the most insistent attacks on the very possibility of a Catholic university, impeding it as a needed force in the secular sphere. But he also counseled sobriety and goodwill. Quote, denying a sympathetic hearing to the central summons of Ex Corde would be tragic, he declared in 1998, recommending instead that, quote, the voice and this summons to a more definitive understanding of the Catholic University deserve to be heard. We are pleased to present such voices, and I look forward to our excellent panel conversation on Ex Corde Ecclesiae on transformative education in an expansive Catholic key, and on the promise and project of Catholic higher education in the 21st century. I want to thank Nick for giving us some of the Zoom outlines, but I want to remind our viewers that today's Zoomcast is classified as a webinar. I mean, we're all experts here, right? This means the chat is restricted, it's disabled, and we'll use the Q&A tab for questions. So please direct those questions. We'll just type them in. But I encourage you to listen actively and to type as we go. That makes it more dynamic in your own hearing. And then I'm able to kind of cull them as we go along and get as many voices in as possible when we get to the Q&A part. So that's it. If you think it, write it down and submit it. Simple as that. So then, and thank you for that, everybody. So then, let us welcome our speakers. Mr. Andrew Crema, a doctoral student in philosophy, Dr. Naomi Fisher, Dr. Marcella Lin, and Dr. Joe Vukov. All four are from the Department of Philosophy, and we kind of selected them out of the larger group just because they were representative and they drew the straws. So Andrew Crema, welcome to our Zoom stage, my friend, and good luck on your remarks. Thank you, one and all.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for the opportunity to speak today. Again, my name is Andrew Crema. I'm a third-year PhD student in philosophy here at Loyola. I served as the assistant editor for this first volume of Nexus. Before I begin my talk, I want to thank Mike again, first for having the vision of establishing a publication like Loyola and beginning it with a discussion on Ex Corde. I want to thank Naomi, our editor, for our conversations that we had about Catholic education 2 years ago. That prompted our group and for all of your work on Nexus. And then lastly, I want to thank all the writers for their contributions, both to the journal and to our working group. In my brief presentation, I want to give an overview of the volume, the topics discussed, and my own reflections. But before I begin, I want to just say that this journal is a first fruit of a group now known as the Hank Center Working Group for Catholic Higher Education, of which I am a founding member. This working group was started by a small group of faculty and graduate students, mostly from the philosophy department, who are Catholic and wanted to better understand the idea of a Catholic university. I think that I speak for all of us in the Hank Center Working Group that our motivation for participating in this group and conducting research in this area does not merely stem from the need for pure ideas. Rather, it came from our own experience, from our anxieties, questions, and concerns that were prompted maybe by conversations with others, from our teaching, from our engagement in the university, and most importantly, from our own faith experience. This Nexus volume on St. John Paul II's Apostolic Constitution, Ex Corde Ecclesiae, addresses many of these basic questions on a Catholic university education that we had raised at the beginning 2 years ago. So our Nexus volume is divided into 3 parts that each concern a basic question pertaining to the Catholic university. The first section concerns the end or purpose of a Catholic university. Jeff Fisher argues in his article that the end of a Catholic education is not useful knowledge, nor is it the development of moral character. Rather, the Catholic university aims at wisdom, knowledge of ultimate truths. As Fisher argues, citing Ex Corde, truth is the fundamental value without which freedom, justice, and human dignity are extinguished. Treating justice as the primary and ultimate concern of human endeavors will, ironically enough, inhibit justice. Richard Kim concurs with Fisher in his article that the end of a Catholic university education is intellectual, not moral cultivation. Yet this does not mean that a Catholic university is indifferent to the moral and spiritual dimensions of human life. Rather, moral and spiritual development are significant secondary ends of the university. Fisher and Kim provide a timely reminder that as important as moral cultivation, justice, and social justice are, and indeed, as John Paul II recognizes in Ex Corde, these are very important concerns of Catholic university. Yet these are not the primary ends of the university. Instead, as St. John Paul II affirms, the university is to pursue the cause of truth. And it is within the context of this pursuit of truth that the relationship between faith and reason is brought to light and meaning. Faith and reason coincide at a Catholic university in a united endeavor, as John Paul II says, to enable people to come to the full measure of their humanity, created in the image and likeness of God, renewed in Christ, and called to shine forth in the light of the Spirit. Hence, in the idea of a Catholic university, faith and reason are instrumental towards the pursuit of truth in toto. Recently, I've reflected on this point of the centrality of faith at the Catholic University. What is faith? Faith is not a leap in the dark to be taken in the absence of light, driven by blind emotion, or as a subjective light capable of perhaps warming the heart and bringing personal consolation. Rather, faith is the recognition of an objective and exceptional presence, God. Faith begins with an encounter of a person. We can think of the first disciples who heard John the Baptist point out Jesus. They then went to Jesus to ask him where he was staying and followed him. Out of this encounter with Jesus, they later came to faith, to recognize Jesus as the Lord, as the one in whom they gain a meaning for their whole life. This is crucial for a Catholic university, as John Paul II expresses in a myriad of ways. Namely, the Catholic University is a place where Christ can be encountered and where his message is proclaimed. He even says that Catholic universities make an important contribution to the Church's work of evangelization. This is perhaps one of many passages in Ex Corde that is provocative with respect to the state and direction of Catholic universities today. The second section of Nexus concerns the engagement between Catholicism and other traditions. Avery Smith's article offers a concrete way in which Christ can be encountered in the university context. She argues that Jesus cannot be restricted only to the discipline of theology, but should also belong to philosophy. She proposes a hermeneutical approach to do so. While John Paul II affirms both the claim that the Catholic University is called to be an authentically and distinctively Catholic institution, and the claim that the Catholic University is at the service of the Church, the latter being a prominent theme of Ex Corde, about which much more could be said. Neither of these claims mean that the Catholic University is supposed to be a place where only Catholics are welcome. People of other faith traditions and of no faith are to be members of Catholic universities. So then, how should interreligious dialogue work at a Catholic university, or even generally? Shuying Wang argues in her paper that John Paul II offers in Ex Corde a vision for interreligious dialogue. He calls for an inclusivistic dialogue that avoids the two extremes of an exclusive and zealous proselytization on the one hand, and a relativistic pluralist vision on the other. Inclusivistic dialogue demands an authentic Catholic identity, as well as a respect for other religious traditions, which allows for understanding and authentic dialogue to occur. In a similar manner, Father James Murphy argues against a relativist conception of values and pluralism. He stakes out a replacement for such notions in a critical openness to and rational dialogue with other cultures and traditions. He grounds this normative pluralism in a notion of dialogic reason, which requires that we engage openly and rationally with other cultures and traditions while challenging them with distinctively Christian reasons. In short, relativism restrains us from searching for the truth, more specifically, from searching for the truth together. At this point, we should turn to the third section on the nature of truth-seeking at a Catholic university. And likewise, I'll conclude my talk here, since all three of our panelists today will give a more in-depth look at their papers that consist of this third topic. I just want to conclude by saying that Ex Corde is a brief yet rich text that I think can help us in many ways understand the distinct purpose of a Catholic university for the Church and the world today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So I will just share my screen here. So thanks very much to Andrew, and thank you to Andrew and Mike and everyone who made this possible, and especially to all the other contributors. Our conversations were very formative in my thinking about the current challenges to and tasks of Catholic higher education. So I will be talking about hope, and particularly the role of hope in an education that aims at truth. So the main idea that I'll be arguing for here is that students in the contemporary university, and I think at our university in particular, are suffering from a lack of hope And professors all too often inculcate despair in their students when they focus singularly on injustice and evil in the world. So Catholic universities in possession of the whole truth can work against this tendency. We can train and encourage students to see the good in the world, to love truth, and to present them with reasons for hope. So let me begin by offering two anecdotes. So the first one involves a student in my introductory philosophy class, and she turned in an assignment to a reading response in which I asked how best to seek after the truth. And in her response, she questioned whether we should seek after the truth because the truth is too depressing. She said, "I was happier when I was young, and I believed that the world was full of good people. In comparison to nowadays, when all you see and read is sickness and death and war, and people fighting for stupid made-up reasons and power. Of course, there is still happiness and joy in the world, and everyone needs to find their own piece of bliss. The more you learn about the world and the people and problems that live on it, the sadder things get." So this was, I was taken aback by this, in part because this student, she does not strike me as melancholic by nature. She's brilliant, enthusiastic, genuine. So coming from her, this seemed like a very bleak and dark picture of the world. And it also seemed to crystallize what you find among a lot of students, which is a kind of exhaustion or weariness about their education and about learning in general, and an increasingly sort of depressing and bleak picture of the world. And I think this is, it should disturb us, I think, to think that this is what students are getting out of the education here. And if this is what they're getting out of the education here, then perhaps we are, insofar as this is the case, we are failing. The second anecdote involves a faculty seminar with the Hank Center here at Loyola. It was led by Father Dan Hartnett, who is a Jesuit priest. He served for 2 decades in Peru. He also spent a decade here at Loyola as a philosophy professor. And we were talking about teaching, and a colleague in a different department talked about her own approach to teaching, and she talked about it in a way that I think is fairly typical. She said she liked to freak students out. She liked to expose them to all of the messed up things going on, and so hopefully provoke them into action. And Father Dan Hartnett offered, I think this, he offered it very kindly and gently, but I think it is a rebuke to that view of things. He said, we must give our students hope. And that struck me at the time. It seems to get at the central issue here, that there's something about our education that is causing students to despair, and we have to work against that tendency. We have to give our students hope. So why think that hope is essential to an education? So hope is not often talked about in the context of an education, but Ex Corde has been really formative in my thinking about this, and also in thinking that we should talk more about hope in the context of an education. So according to Ex Corde, and as described by Andrew, the end of a university is to seek truth and to cultivate the intellects of the students so that they themselves become truth seekers. Accordingly, St. John Paul II talks a lot about love of truth and knowledge, the joy of seeking after truth and the joy of seeking after knowledge. If students don't have hope, they will not love truth and they will have no motivation to pursue it. So then we won't be creating truth seekers because they are too depressed by the truth to seek it out, and we will be failing in our mission as a university. Second, one of the 4 universal apostolic preferences of the Jesuits is to accompany young people in the creation of a hope-filled future. If we are instead creating a despair-filled future or presenting so bleak a picture of the world to young people that they cannot possibly hope, then we are not only failing as a university, then we are also failing as a Jesuit institution. So what do I mean by hope? What is hope? So first we can talk about what hope is not. So hope cannot be a simple, naive optimism. It cannot be a burying one's head in the sand, a refusal to look at the hard truths of evil, injustice, suffering. It also cannot be the idea, some sort of historical progressivism, this idea that things inevitably get better with the march of time. Rather, I think this definition offered by St. Thomas Aquinas gets at a notion of Christian hope, which is central here. He says, the object of hope is a future good, arduous but possible to obtain. So this requires not any of those other bad versions of hope, but rather it requires a recognition of the good and a belief that it is possible. So in this way, we can inculcate hope by encouraging students to be attentive to goodness and the potential for goodness in the world around them. And we can encourage them to believe in it, to believe in that goodness and to cultivate it, to believe that it's possible to bring it about. So how did we arrive at this situation where, as I've argued, that we're presenting our students with this overly bleak picture of the world? I say that the humanities are dominated by the critical stance. And by this, I mean a broad approach to history, text, institutions, and social structures that aims primarily at unmasking and unmaking the structures of power which operate behind the scenes. So we can think of these three. Paul Ricoeur termed them the masters of suspicion, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, who dig behind, right, the superficial or professed meaning of things to find the underlying, often unflattering picture. There are, 20th century heirs to this tradition. This is a picture of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. So scholars like Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, and we can think of contemporary descendants in Foucault, in post-structuralism, in decolonialism. This is I don't want to say that this that we should not teach Marx or Nietzsche or Freud or Foucault or any of these people. It is absolutely crucial to look at the way that power structures operate in the world. It is incredibly important work that has been done by these scholars, and their work 100% has a place in the university. My worry is that if this stance is taken not merely as a single method, but as a totalizing world picture, then over the course of 4 years, students are led to believe, in the words of my student, that this is all there is. All there is sickness and death and war and people fighting for stupid made up reasons and power. So the worry is that this partial truth, looking at the way that power structures operate and perpetuate themselves in the world, can then masquerade as the whole truth, such that students don't recognize any truth beyond what they find in what I've called the critical stance. So how then do we work against this tendency? How do we work to give our students hope? So the Catholic University is in a unique position. We are, as Catholics, in possession of the whole truth and can accordingly point students to the good without falling into a naive optimism or a simplistic historical progressivism. So we believe that the world is grounded in goodness and all things have their destiny in the good. And accordingly, to truly understand evil, we can't understand it in isolation, but should understand it as a corruption of the good. What this means that when we're thinking about how messed up things are, or when we're presenting our students with all the messed up things about the world, we should always do so with reference to what those things could and should be, to see the seeds of goodness in them. And so we can hope to move those things toward their own particular good. This means that we can continue to expose injustice using the critical stance as a method, but with an eye fixed firmly on truth, goodness, and beauty. And we can encourage students to be attentive to the good. And I like to do this in my own classes by, pointing them to their own experiences of goodness, to childhood memories, to experience of nature, to the experience of the kindness of other human beings, so that they can then recognize goodness when they find it, seek it out, and cultivate it. So to sum up, Catholic universities are thereby uniquely equipped to better fulfill the mission of a university, which is the pursuit of truth, by grounding our inquiries always in hope and giving our students reason to love truth and to thereby pursue it. Thank you. That's the end.
Thanks, Naomi. I'll share my slides here for my talk. Okay, so the title of my talk is Pursuing Truth in the Catholic University. I'm Marcella Lynn. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy. So I'll start with a quote. This is from Ex Corde near the beginning, and it outlines the task of the Catholic University. In Ex Corde, St. John Paul II says, a Catholic university's privileged task is to unite existentially by intellectual effort two orders of reality that too frequently tend to be placed in opposition as though they were antithetical: the search for truth and the certainty of already knowing the fount of truth. So I want to focus on that perceived tension between searching the truth impartially and the certainty of already knowing the truth. And I argue that Catholic universities are in fact better equipped to pursue truth impartially than their secular counterparts. These next two slides get at what I think is the source of the apparent tension, the tension between impartially pursuing the truth and being certain of the fount of truth. And I draw from my experience in teaching, especially when I teach the free will debate. So when I teach the free will debate, especially when I teach determinism, I think something comes up that's indicative here of the source of this apparent tension. So here's the basic argument. It's given by Galen Strawson. This is what he calls it, that kind of raises concerns for students. So I'll just read it real quickly. We do what we do because of the way we are. So to be responsible for what we do, we must be responsible for the way we are, but we can't be responsible for the way we are. So therefore we can't be responsible for what we do. And the discussion here is really focused on that premise 3 and why we aren't responsible for the way we are. And he points to our attitudes, dispositions, our values, our desires that all sort of, that cause our actions and choices. But when we trace back those mental dispositions, we find other sources that we're not wholly the author of. And so the idea here is, we inherit things like our natural dispositions. We are affected by our early upbringing, our early experiences. They shape us in some way, and even subsequent decisions to modify or solidify our character is always made within a motivational structure that we've inherited. It's always traced back to some kind of attitude or disposition that we wholly didn't create. And this isn't just a point about, this is commonly what happens, or it's very hard to self-create. It's a point that it's metaphysically impossible for finite beings to create ourselves in a way that would ground freedom, what Strawson calls the true sense of freedom. So in response to reading about determinism, I find that students are haunted by determinism. And so those aren't scare quotes over haunted. That's what a student told me in a subsequent semester, that she was still haunted by determinism and still affected by this argument. And I find that that's a theme in my class discussions and assignments when students reflect on these things, is that they're bothered by the argument, they're bothered by the view, they can't see what's wrong with it, but they know we need to reject it. And so there's a discomfort there. And philosophers too. I mean, one philosopher recently called it the troubling train of thought. Okay, so that is, let me try that. Okay, so that's the experience that I have teaching, and here's a connection to the impartial truth. I have it, I hope, succinctly summarized in this statement. So just as some doubt the freedom of a choice or action that traces back to something not wholly self-created, so too might they doubt the impartiality of an inquiry that begins with the presumption that God is the source of all truth. And so I think there's something similar going on here, that John Paul II is identifying, that there's this concern that if you start with that presupposition, that you're maybe begging the question, you're partial, and you're not being like, the empirical scientists who observe the world and just reports on its various aspects. So I think the shared presupposition in this, deterministic view, as well as the tension that JP2 identifies, is that these starting points are in tension with freedom and impartiality. So here's my response. Response to the shared presupposition that starting points are in tension with freedom and impartiality. My response is to imagine alternatives. What are our options here? If we don't have a starting point, then we can start from nowhere. We can say, take the ground out, start free from any commitments, and free our choices or actions from any determining factors, like any kind of mental disposition, or start our inquiry without any commitments to any belief in truth, let alone the certainty in the fount of truth. But the problem here is that it leads to arbitrariness. So when it comes to free action, if you say that only undetermined actions are free, then it doesn't appear to be any freer than an action that is determined by your character. If you were just as likely to perform a different action than the one you did perform. And similarly, when it comes to inquiry, if you try to start free of all commitments, you're not going to get very deep. And I think teachers can recognize this in trying to generate a class discussion with a very broad question like, what did you think? That's not going to generate as deep of a discussion as one that kind of has some parameters in place. And so what we get from this is the idea that true freedom and good inquiry is not something that begins free from all confines, but something that's really takes place within the confines of what's true and what's good. Okay, so if we can't start from nowhere, we have to start from somewhere. Why start from God? Why not start from some human institution? Why not a political ideology or the methods of science that seems to be a popular option, or the methods of anthropology or sociology? Well, here we're led back to the problem of partiality, and I'll talk about that in a second. So what does St. John Paul II say? He says that in Ex Corde, says that by its Catholic character, a university is made more capable of conducting an impartial search for truth, a search that is neither subordinated to nor conditioned by particular interests of any kind. So the key point here is that it's not subordinated to nor conditioned by particular interests. And when you start with a human as opposed to the divine source in your inquiry, you're starting from a particular set of interests. When you're pursuing truth within an academic discipline, it's not going to get you at a higher truth, a universal truth. You'll get partial truths that the Catholic University then seeks to integrate across the different fields. So rather than these other two options of starting from nowhere, some human institution, I think the solution here is to start from God, from that certainty in the fount of truth, that a Catholic university is uniquely positioned to do. Okay, so this is all kind of theoretical reflections and ideas. But I think that practically speaking, what this means is in terms of how we do this as a university, as teachers, as students, et cetera, other people involved in university life, is through evangelization. It is through encountering Christ at some point in the student's formation in order to experience a fount of truth by being in contact with truth itself. And I end here with this quote. So what this practical solution does is unite the Catholic University's mission to pursue truth with its mission to evangelize. And so this is what JP2 says are the basic activities of a Catholic university in harmony with the church's mission of evangelization. This is what the university does. I've highlighted one part because I'm a teacher, so that's the kind of part that speaks to me. I'm in a teaching focused position here. And that's education offered in a faith context that forms men and women capable of rational and critical judgment and conscious of the transcendent dignity of the human person. And so that's something I think as teachers we can do in the classroom. And I'll leave, further discussion for later, but yeah, that's it for my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcella. And thank you to Mike and Naomi and Andrew, to all the organizers for putting on this great event today. My name is Joe Vukov. I'm also in the philosophy department here at Loyola. And today I'm going to be offering some comments on science, religion, and the disaffiliation crisis. So what I want to do today is start by identifying for you a problem. And it's a problem that comes with two sides. So here's the first side of the problem. It's well documented that people believe that science and religion are in conflict with each other. I could have quoted survey data for you ad nauseum. I'll just give you a couple of data points to motivate this point. 59% of Americans across the board believe that science and religion are often, as opposed to only sometimes, in conflict. And 34% of US adults with a religious affiliation perceive conflict between science and their own religious tradition. So this is not merely people from the outside looking into religion and thinking that there's a deep conflict between a science-based view and a religious-based outlook, but people often within religious traditions perceive that conflict as well. And this is not merely an intellectual dissonance that's being documented. It leads to real-world results. Recent survey, when asking Catholics specifically about disaffiliating from Catholicism, 36% indicated that the conflict between science and religion was important or very important reason for leaving. By reference point here, only 30% indicated that their reason was that they had stopped believing in God. So the conflict between science and religion, or the perception of conflict between science and religion, is a real problem with real consequences. And of course, the disaffiliation crisis in the Catholic Church cannot be traced to the single cause, obviously, to this perception of conflict. It's hard to deny that the perception of conflict between science and religion is part of the reason that are motivating many young people to disaffiliate from the Catholic Church. Really, though, I needn't have shown you all this data to make the point that a lot of people perceive there to be conflict between science and religion. I went on Google and just pulled a couple of images to illustrate this. Here was one that I thought was kind of amusing. This is Jesus and Darwin karate, having a karate match or something like that. Here's kind of tongue-in-cheek recreation of the Sistine Chapel. And my favorite is the evolution of bumper stickers, starting out with your Christian fish bumper sticker. This evolves into the Darwin fish animal eating the Jesus fish, which evolves into the truth fish eating the Darwin fish animal. And my favorite, I can't actually believe this is an actual bumper sticker, but apparently it is, Tyrannosaurus Rex eating the truth fish, eating the Darwin fish animal thing. I think at this point, I've lost track of exactly what the bumper sticker is supposed to be promoting, if this is a pro-science or a pro-religion bumper sticker. But I think my 6-year-old would interpret this maybe in the best way, which is that dinosaurs are really cool. So all that's to say is that we see this meme of science and religion being in conflict, both in the survey data and also just in popular culture. It really isn't difficult to find. But that brings us to the other side of the problem, which is that people actually don't know that much about either science or religion. I could have pulled data from any religion here, but I decided to focus on Catholicism because that's what we're talking about today. Recently, 66% of Catholics agreed with the statement, Jesus is the first and greatest being created by God, which of course is a near verbatim statement of the Arian heresy. which is especially surprising among Catholics who presumably are regularly saying the Nicene Creed, which of course is a line-by-line rejection of Arianism. And I could go down a whole bunch of different places where we have very good data to show that people aren't aware and don't know about many of the central teachings of their own religious tradition. If you thought the science end of things was better, it's really not. 61% of Americans were recently shown to be classified as having only medium or low scientific knowledge. So what should we make of this? On the one hand, we have this rampant perception of conflict between science and religion. And on the other hand, we have very good data to show that people actually don't tend to know that much about either. One thing I'd like to suggest, one sort of tentative conclusion, is that the perception of conflict may be based on misunderstanding rather than understanding. And in fact, that is the direction that I want to take my comments here today, suggesting that this conflict model, this idea that religion and science are at loggerheads with each other, is a very simplistic one. What's wrong with conflict, and why is that a problematic way of approaching issues in science and religion and the relationship between the two? Here's what I want to suggest to you. We could call it the Augustinian thesis. It's the idea that all truth is God's truth. Here's Augustine himself. Let every true and good and true Christian understand that whatever truth may be found, it belongs to his master. What is this getting at? One way of paraphrasing Augustine here is to say this: since all truths all have God as their source, these truths cannot contradict. Insofar then as both science and religion aim at discovering the truth, there can be at bedrock no conflict between the two. We could actually give a purely non-theological gloss to this idea that's, I think, behind the Augustinian thesis, which is simply this: that truths can't contradict each other, that truth is in some way unified. So insofar as science and religion aim at the truth, insofar as they aim at giving us truth about ourselves, about each other, and about the world around us, they can't conflict fundamentally. Superficially, sure, and I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but fundamentally, there can't be conflict between science and religion insofar as both stay on target and are aiming at uncovering truths. In Ex Corde Ecclesiae, St. John Paul II points us past the conflict model to a healthier way of understanding this relationship between science and religion. So here's a couple of quotes from Ex Corde. It is the honor and responsibility of a Catholic university to consecrate itself without reserve to the cause of truth. And then later on, an area that particularly interests a Catholic university is the dialogue between Christian thought and the modern sciences. Such dialogue concerns the natural sciences as much as the human sciences, which posit new and complex philosophical and ethical problems. So what Ex Corde is doing here is pushing us past this commonly perceived but ultimately problematic model of thinking about science and religion in conflict with each other to one in which we understand science and religion to be in dialogue with each other. And here I want to riff on some scholarship by Ian Barber from about 20 years ago. And Barber talks about this idea of science and religion being in dialogue in these terms. According to this approach, science and religion can approach the very same issues or questions, but it's not that they're conflicting with each other. It's rather that they're approaching those issues and questions from different perspectives and with different ideas in mind. Both perspectives are incomplete, yet through dialogue, the two can yield a more complete understanding of whatever it is we are trying to grasp. It's a pretty abstract way of putting it, so I wanted to give you just one quick example of what the dialogue model can look like in action. So I put all these numbers up there and in terms, don't worry, there is no quiz after this talk. I just wanted to put up the entire equation for you to take a look at. What you're looking at right now is called the Drake equation, which is supposed to give us a way of estimating the likelihood of intelligent life in the Milky Way and us making contact with that life. And it's this equation that guides much of the research in astrobiology, the research into life on other planets outside of our own. I just want to give you just a brief reflection on one of the terms of of the Drake equation that I think gives us insight into the way that this conversation has developed. So one of the terms is the number of planets with an environment suitable for life. In other words, how many planets are out there kind of like Earth, that life could emerge on it. And initially, you might think that that number would be fairly low. It's actually not quite right. So I just pulled these numbers about a week ago, and you'll see that as of now, there are 4,500 confirmed planets outside of the solar system. That's what an exoplanet is. And of those, 166 are terrestrial. So they are Earth-like. According to a recent journal article in the Astronomical Journal, the estimate is that there could be up to 300 million habitable planets in the Milky Way. Again, I won't go into the other terms of the Drake equation, but needless to say, the data that we've been able to gather has led us to this conclusion, is that whether or not there's extraterrestrial life out there, we should be surprised. We should be surprised if it's out there in that we found other intelligent life, but we also should be surprised if there wasn't any, because that would mean that even though the universe has vast potential for life, it only happened for us. Why do I bring this in as an example of dialogue? It's because I think these reflections, purely empirical reflections on the possibility of intelligent extraterrestrial life, can lead us as people with religious commitments, or specifically Christian commitments, to some really, I think, interesting theological reflection. Here's just a couple of questions that this might lead us to ask. What if there's intelligent life elsewhere? Would they have fallen as well? Would and could Jesus become incarnate elsewhere? Does the church extend to other planets? These are the kinds of questions that aren't necessarily ones of conflict between science and religion, but rather one of mutual engagement. And that's the kind of vision that I ultimately want to propose today in this talk. And I'll just read these final conclusions. As educators in Catholic universities, the pursuit of truth through dialogue is what we should be about, pushing aside appearances, biases, and misconceptions in order to get at the way things really are. That's our task, and it should be one that all of us, those in the sciences, humanities, and teaching religion, should aim at relentlessly. Ex Corde and the Augustinian thesis add a further gloss for theists. Insofar as all truth is God's, a relentless pursuit of truth is ultimately a relentless pursuit of God. The relationship between science and religion, rather than pushing us, and as we've seen, many of today's youth, away from God and away from religion, can and should draw us towards him. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, all speakers. Much appreciated for your excellent insights. I have loads of questions coming in. I'm going to start with some of my own here. I'm going to work backwards, start with you, Joe Vukov, right away. And just thinking of your last slides and extraterrestrial life, that really takes science and religion to a certain level. I'm thinking of a brother Guy Consolmano, and Pope Francis recently, speaking like, would you baptize an alien? That kind of question. The answer was yes, because there's a really cosmological Trinitarianism at play there. But I think the point is, though, that Catholics, this tradition has always been very easy with science and religion, as opposed to maybe to other Christianities. I could say Father John Carci from Mundelein Seminary, who's the rector there. He's an astrophysicist by training. So this is something really fundamental. But Joe, let me just ask you about that Catholic intellectual tradition and religion and science. Even like The Sparrow by Russell, right? Jesuits in Space. So I recommend that. But what's that impediment? Like when you're out there and you're kind of lecturing on this, or you're thinking about it, do you find a lot of believers that have a hard time with this? Like why does it matter?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mike. And thanks for the shout outs to Brother Guy and Father John. And actually, I was just teaching The Sparrow this morning. So things are coming together. Yeah, I think, so here's what I think is that I think that a lot of times, even though conflict might not be the best way of thinking about what is ultimately going on in science and religion. Again, I wanted to toss out this idea that at their best, science and religion are pursuing truth. And if that's true, they can't be deeply in conflict because they're ultimately heading to the same destination. But here's where I think this perception of conflict comes up, is that I think it's true a lot of times of our experience. And sometimes it's an experience of outright conflict. Again, I think if you're a young earth creationist and you're taking an evolutionary biology class, that conflict is fairly explicit. I think, as you say, Mike, I think that the Catholic intellectual tradition has resources that mitigate against those sort of very explicit conflicts that come up maybe in other traditions. But I still think there's places where if the conflict isn't that explicit, it's still at the back of somebody's mind. So take something like, what do we make of our account of Genesis, or the Catholic teaching that there's a special creation of the human soul in light of what we know from evolutionary biology? There's a recent genetics paper that suggests that the lowest the human population could have ever been based on genetic diversity in the human population now was somewhere around like 24,000 people. So are those 24,000 people, is that what we mean by Adam and Eve? Is that what we mean by sort of the place where humanity emerged? Is that outright conflict? Not quite, but I think that a lot of times in my experience teaching this, my students experience it as conflict. And to be honest, sometimes I experience some of this as conflict too, where it's not clear exactly what we should say. Even something like the special creation of the human soul. I study philosophy of mind. That's where my primary area of research is in, and I tend to be fairly naturalistic when it comes to the study of mind. I think that neuroscience and cognitive psychology are some of our best resources. So how does that fit with this idea that I'm supposed to believe as a Catholic that there's a unique and special creation of my soul? Conflict? Not quite, but some tension? Absolutely. So I think what I wanted to push towards in my comment today is taking that experience that could initially be experienced as conflict and encouraging both myself and others to push through that experience towards something that looks more like dialogue, which is dealing with the tension, I think, but dealing with it in a different way.
Yeah, it's really important because if we just take the word dialogue is really interesting, isn't it? It's not some benign, innocuous thing where everything's going to be okay, but doesn't mean it explodes. Dialogue's holding up two truths at once. And that's such Catholic kung fu, if you think about it, because I think it was John Jenkins of Notre Dame who said that to have a Catholic imagination is you take two opposite seeming ideas and you hold them up and proceed as if they're not opposite, right? And so we can mark that. Naomi Fisher, you have a master's in physics. You have any thoughts on these questions?
No, I just I'm grateful to Joe for his very clear presentation of the way to move beyond conflict to productive dialogue without denying that that there's a lot of tension there, but we only experience it as conflict if we hold to those two truths sort of more dogmatically. I will say that I think some of the people who are most open to religion are people who are deep into the sciences. So I found more openness among the physicists in my graduate program than I find often among the humanists in my philosophy PhD program who are atheists, say, or other philosophical contexts. And so I think that points to something about the intellectual humility that follows when you get sort of deep into something. You realize, I don't possess all the answers, and there's so much that I don't know. And the way to move toward greater understanding is not to hold dogmatically to one particular interpretation of one particular belief, but rather to sort of allow those beliefs to interact in productive ways. So I'm grateful to Joe for his comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up really quick on this idea of intellectual humility. And I think it's one reason why dialogue is such a helpful word. We haven't entered into dialogue if we aren't open to hearing other perspectives and listening to what other people have to say. It's a monologue otherwise, it's a soliloquy. So dialogue sort of has this idea of intellectual humility that I'm limited in my perspective built into it. And I think actually, from a religious standpoint, I think sometimes we have a lot to learn from the sciences. The sciences have intellectual humility built into them in a way. That's what the scientific method is all about, is assuming that there are things we're missing and how can we get closer to the truth. And I think that with those of us with religious convictions could learn a lot from that. And I think that the failure of intellectual humility is what leads into conflict. And I think that the worst kinds of conflict are the kinds of scientism and fundamentalism that are ultimately distinguished precisely by a lack of intellectual humility.
Great. Our colleague Michael Shook in Theology says this. He thinks that the scientists are the new theologians. And I think as long as, you know, and that could be qualified, of course, but I think with that intellectual humility built in and the wonder built in, that might be true. With the humility, we have to remember our Ignatian presupposition at Loyola. And what does Ignatius say? When you're in conversation, the first move is to put a good interpretation on your dialogue partner rather than condemn her or him. And we could all learn from that kind of spirituality that this tradition brings. Marcella, I'm going to defer. I have a question that came right in from Father Schlesser. And it's perfect. It's a perfect question. So Father Schlesser of history writes, I'm struck by the determinism slide from Marcella. This was the fundamental issue for Jacques and Raissa Maritain as college students at the Sorbonne about 120 years ago, which led to their suicide pact, right? Which was never carried out because they met Henri Bergson. Well, they also met Léon Blois, Steve, which, the next week. But Steve says, he asks, is there a difference between early 21st century determinism and late 19th century determinism? This might get into what Naomi was observing too in her students. But please, Marcella, what do you think?
Yeah, that's funny. Just Naomi popped into my head of, well, we need hope. And good that some people got that hope before going through that pact. But I'm not, just to put my cards on the table, I don't do a lot of research in the history of determinism. I'm familiar with some of the more recent stuff, and I taught a 18th century French philosopher, Baron d'Holbach, in some of my classes. So one of the things I've noticed more recently is a lot more emphasis on being the source of an authentic source of one's actions, a focus on, do we develop ourselves freely? Can we create ourselves in a way that can ground moral responsibility and freedom? And some of the themes I've seen in earlier traditions were really focused on that ability to choose between alternatives. Can we, is it when a choice appears to present itself, are we able to choose in one direction over another? And that theme still gets taken up now, but I think maybe the emphasis on being the authentic source of action that for me then it overlaps with questions I'm interested in about character. So that's where I kind of have been exposed to this. And yeah, I think that it really reveals these warring notions about freedom that I think we can think about, this freedom to kind of do anything or to be free of constraints, or that notion kind of pushes up against this, I think, more Catholic notion of freedom to be what God calls us to be, freedom to be who we really are as human beings, to develop our nature, to align with what's true and good. And so I think maybe that kind of comes out in the Catholic tradition much more prominently, that can give hope.
Yeah, Father Schlesser followed up because he said, well, what about a vision of determinism that's maybe a little different, but not much? For 21st century people, we have the reality of climate catastrophe, right? That might also, maybe Naomi, this is for you, and Andrew, please chime in, maybe as a younger person, as a student. But Naomi, people feel like things are pretty bleak. I mean, the climate reality is pretty paralyzing. That's a kind of determinism. How do you think about those kind of things?
Again, I think that it's important to, not think of hope as a kind of prediction. Christian hope isn't a view of history. It's not the idea that no, things are getting better throughout time. And it can coexist with dire predictions and dire circumstances. So, when we think about images of the kingdom of God that we get, say, in the Gospels, or even in Hebrews, when we think about, what Christian hope really is, it's not, it's something precious that you find, and that is worth everything. So we don't have to believe that the creation of a better world is inevitable, or even predicted by our best scientific models. But we can believe that a creation of a better world is possible, and we can work together to do that. And all we have to do is believe in its possibility. So when we think about the dire predictions of climate models, say, we have to say, well, what could we do? Like, what could we create together to work against this? What kind of world is possible for us to get together and work together for? So I think that's how I would respond to that kind of thing. I'm not an expert on climate change, of course, but I think it is important when we are exposing students to these terrible truths that we do keep an eye fixed on the good.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. Just so I can speak personally about that. You talked about partial truths and whole truths, and the Catholic view, quite literally, seeks after the whole, wants the whole truth. And it's not, you can make a little kind of funny statement about, Whiggish utopianism and endless progress, and not sound retrograde about it, like you're locked in some museum piece thinking. It's not that, but hope knows both. Hope knows the fullness, right? It's not always going to be what you want. It might be what you need. But I think Pope Francis brings that to the climate conversation. He brings a certain kind of hope. But I'll leave it there. Andrea, what do you think about what you're hearing here?
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add right now to the, to the discussion on climate. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess, to some extent, I don't know. I would say maybe move on to another question.
Sure. What about, how about something about, from your remarks about, because you're speaking about, and not so much the great editorial work that you did, but the idea of the Catholic University being a place where at least the encounter, that we can speak about the encounter with God in an intellectual environment, right? So how does that, what are your hopes for, how might that happen in our courses and disciplines? So maybe speak from your own heart there.
Sure. I mean, I think, the main way maybe that we can, I mean, because I think it's hard to, especially for me as a student and a graduate worker, right, to talk about like institutional ways, because John Paul II also talks about, in a way, the institution itself bearing witness to Christ, and that's talking about presidents and people who are up at the top really making certain decisions. But I guess I could talk kind of as the way Marcella did about, as an educator and as a student, right? That we're able to bear witness, that we're able to represent Christ to other people by, in some way, being Christ-like, right? Like, I don't know, like, recently, I had some freshman students that in a class I'm TAing for, they had plagiarized on their midterm exam, probably by accident. That's what it looked like. And instead of like punishing them, I mean, I kind of explained what it was. In short, like, I guess I tried to be merciful, right? Showing people mercy, showing them compassion, and looking at them, in a way that shows that I care about them, right? And yeah, I mean, I think it's something like that, right? Like that, that we were able to, in some ways, love our students, right?
That might be what the that we hear all the time, the cura personalis, right?
Right.
But that might be just a living example of a cura personalis that maybe is practiced in this way. Well, thank you, Andrew, for that. Naomi, one for you, then I'm going to get to our many questions from the crowd. But let me ask you, it's a pretty charged thing about the critical stance. Those are very pointed, but you qualify well, in my opinion. But let me focus more on our young people. How might education in philosophy, maybe, but maybe elsewhere, how might it mitigate against this kind of exhaustion that you're seeing? Like, can you diagnose further? What are some steps to, what are some remedies? Is that the right word for it? What do you think?
I mean, I think it's hard to talk in generalities about that kind of thing. Let me actually bring this back to a question that I see was asked by Dr. Jackie Scott in philosophy. Hi, Jackie. She asked us to say more about me and Marcella, so maybe Marcella wants to jump in. Given our comments, how might we apply recommendations regarding education at a Catholic university to Loyola's commitment to counter racism and to be an anti-racist institution? So I think there is an opportunity here to offer some kind of synthesis. What I've called the critical stance, and I've called it a method, it offers some kind of partial truth, I think. Yes, absolutely, there are these power structures, they perpetuate themselves in ways that are pernicious, and we absolutely need to identify them. When we're talking about racism in particular, I think, we tend to focus on injustice and purging that injustice, purging our institution of that injustice. And sometimes I worry, and I don't want to offer any kind of essentialist claims about these movements or disciplines, but sometimes I worry that in the worst manifestations of it, it offers a kind of perfectionism. Or a kind of like, look, we are going to get rid of all of the evil. And this can lead to a kind of burn it all down tendency, I think. But if we synthesize these desires to, really address the evil and injustice in our world with a view of what is truly good, then I think what we can do is, offer something that's richer, offer something that's more hopeful than a lot of the discourse we see going on right now, which can be, I think, really divisive and destructive. And so one way we can do that at Loyola is through authentic dialogue, where we bring our genuine concerns about the state of discourse, where we offer a vision for what human society could look like, and what our institution could look like. And I think that positive vision, which relies, I think, upon focusing on the kernel of goodness in the institution or in the society, is often missing. It's often missing in these presentations. So I think at a Catholic university, we are uniquely situated in order to offer that kind of synthesis.
Marcella, do you have a thought there? And thanks for bringing in Jackie Scott, Dr. Scott's question. That was exactly where we were going to go. Marcella, what do you think about Dr. Scott and her question?
Yeah, hi, Jackie. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, one thing that I thought when Naomi was talking about was, integrating the truths that we get. I know, Naomi, your paper kind of focused on that, the way the critical stance offers a partial truth. And so that kind of shows a way in the topic that I was discussing too, is the way that the Catholic University is especially situated to integrate truth. So I think to me that would look like research-wise is interdisciplinary work that involves, interdisciplinary work. So collaboration between different departments without losing sight of the real value that an individual department can provide. And so like the idea of, I think, the partial truths are still valuable and are still giving us something, and we need to preserve that, but with an eye to how it fits within the whole structure. So not, I guess, not neglecting certain disciplines or methods, reviews in the process. And I think I had another thought too. I guess more so in the classroom, the cura personalis stuff really is at the heart of teaching at a Jesuit university. So starting with the context, and that's going to include what's going on in the world, social events in the world, So in that pursuit of truth, what we want is to form students in a way that allows them to pursue it impartially and to not be maybe sucked into what all the noise that's around certain issues, but to have a space in the classroom to really have a dialogue and discuss these issues in a critical and rational way. So I think in terms of, aligning with fighting against racism, that's something that is so important for students to have that opportunity and to see that, reasonable people might disagree on some of the ins and outs of certain views, but, identifying the shared mission and really keeping that as the goal, the hope-filled future, I think is important.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very important as we move forward in a mission-based approach to our work that as we welcome DEI experts and voices to lead, but also to thread in, we thread our mission together, and there's a way to do that. It's very, there's a gospel way. So it seems to me in our so-called business, these are the conversations we're having right now, and so we need to have them transparently and fully. Let's go jump back into Ex Corde. Maybe Joe, you can start here. I'm thinking about, okay, we have a, Ex Corde had a tough reception for a lot of reasons, mainly because of those general norms and transitional norms, but the general ones. And so if you, could critique your own take on it or bring in some of those critiques, like there's a couple lines in section 2 that here's John Paul writing, the number of non-Catholic teachers should not be allowed to constitute a majority within the institution. That really rattled some people, mainly because, well, are we focusing on identity only and litmus test of who's Catholic, or are we focused on the mission? Like David O'Brien might say, you can't have identity. Mission precedes identity. So things like that. Some of the more problematic things in Ex Corde that I don't want to gloss over them. What were some of the things that people who naysayed? In your researches, what did you find?
Thanks for the question, Mike. So I'll say something. I think I believe this, but I'll throw it out there and see what others think. I think I'll address that line you specifically gave. I think it might be both too strict and not strict enough. So here's what I mean by that. And I think you were getting at this too, Mike, is that you could interpret that in one way as a sort of box checking exercise. And does that fulfill the mission of the university to make sure you've checked the boxes? And it turns out 51% of the faculty have checked the Catholic box, and now you're good to go. I don't think so. And I think the not strict enough side is that it allow. How do I want to put it? I think that the not strict enough side is that mere religious identity does not entail commitment to institutional mission. So just because we've checked that box doesn't necessarily mean that we've got a quorum of faculty members who are on board with institutional mission. On the not strict enough side, I think what I wanted to suggest is that I think it is really crucial for Catholic institutions to have a quorum of faculty who are invested in mission, invested in a Catholic education. And maybe those people are not necessarily checking the Catholic box. Maybe they are when it comes to the religious identity question. But yeah, I think that idea that a majority of people, or at least a big chunk of the faculty at a Catholic university, have to be sympathetic with or on board with or willing to even dialogue with that mission, I think that's a really good thing. So again, I think I believe that. So my answer would be both not strict enough, but also too strict in some ways, and maybe interpreted in a certain way, missing maybe the spirit of the recommendation, which isn't so much as about religious identity and how that shows up on a Pew survey, but is more about investment in the actual mission of the university. And I think those circles of religious identity and those circles of investment in a Catholic university mission could overlap, but that I don't necessarily think they always do.
Thank you, Joe. Anybody else want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, I think it's telling that we as philosophers focused all on the first part and avoided the very practical suggestions of the second part. Like, oh, don't touch that. Let's talk about theory. But I think there's a broader question of how do we maintain a Catholic identity while still sort of genuinely including people who are not Catholic within the community of the university. I worry that we are often so afraid of the differences that we have with each other that we are afraid to assert a genuine Catholic identity. And moreover, that Catholics are so far in the minority that they don't constitute one of the major voices at a lot of Catholic institutions. And I think actually there are two papers in the volume which address this issue. Dr. Shuying Wong's paper and Father Murphy's paper. They offer a different vision of inclusivistic dialogue where, no, we have to be true to who we are while genuinely dialoguing with others, and that we can't genuinely dialogue with others unless we are more fully ourselves. And if we're not, that requires not being afraid of the differences. So yeah, so I think the vision of Ex Corde is prescient in this way, because I think St. John Paul II foresaw that the Catholic University would gradually be losing its identity in the course of the following decades, and wanted to mitigate against that. So the lesson here, I think, is that we have to be more truly who we are. We have to be, and we, especially as Catholics in this institution, have to assert our unique voice in order to be in dialogue with other people of other religious traditions who are within our community.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off on some of what Naomi was just saying. I've been talking a lot about dialogue today, but I think it really is a crucial word here. And when I think about my students, I really want my students to know the best arguments for the existence of God. I also want them to know the best arguments against the existence of God. I want them to know the Catholic teaching on the human soul. Again, I teach a lot of philosophy of mind classes. I want them to know that. I also want them to know reductive materialist accounts of human beings. I want them to know emergent accounts of what human persons are. But I think if those dialogues are sidelined, and not that we're being top down, here's the party line and here's what the only thing we're going to teach. But I think if our students don't know the Catholic positions on those things, and those aren't part of the dialogue, I think that's where the identity of ourselves as a Catholic institution starts to get really watered down. But again, I think that the emphasis on dialogue is really important, right? It's not catechesis, it's discussing in a rigorous way with people who disagree about the issues that Catholics have traditionally found really important.
Thank you. That sounds like a healthy university culture in my hearing. So I thank you both. Andrew or Marcello, you want to quickly weigh in on any of those issues?
Well, I was just thinking we might take as an example from the early church. I mean, you didn't need a majority of people to be witnessing to change hearts, and so the numbers question about having identity, having majority as identity, yeah, this is the spirit of that might make it easier to profess the gospel and to allow students to encounter Christ, but it's still possible without having just a numbers majority, for what it's worth.
No, that's great, Marcella. Thank you. Andrew?
Sure. I mean, I think, I would just say it's obviously important to have people that work at the university that want to buy into the mission, right? And when you don't, the mission either just it becomes irrelevant or it becomes utilized in a different way to promote some other sort of agenda, right? You can sort of transform it into or highlight only certain aspects of it, and then that becomes the mission, right? So yeah, that's always a danger.
There's a couple of famous sayings about mission that you might hear around any university that's Catholic. You might hear, well, no margin, no mission. So we have to make some money first, right? There's all too practical concerns. Or you might hear, on the other hand, that mission is only transmitted by people who possess it. So, I think I'll submit that for your consideration. Move over to Dr. Kevin Stevens, our colleague at Quinlan, and he's offering kind of an observation, but it gets to another part of inculcating and performing and engendering and teaching Catholic ways of being. He's starting a grad level program, transforming MBA programs worldwide, right? This is for the International Association of Jesuit Universities. From being knowledge focused to being focused on discerning leadership. In short, the voyage within, who I am, or who am I, the voyage without, what are the social justice issues that need to be solved, and then practice what I'm going to do. That's a very, not prescriptive, but it's a very pointed way of thinking about academic life in the university today. Any thoughts on Dr. Stevens's program? I would take that as an ascent of. Yeah,
I would say one thing.
Yeah.
You have to make sure, Dr. Stevens, to ask why questions, like why am I ultimately here? That has to be a part of it, right? Like if the students aren't asking these questions, yeah, what's the point of business then, right? So anyways.
It is a revolutionary move in Jesuit universities that people are, and it comes from the apostolic purposes, I think, but there's a lot of work on discernment, on the exercises of changing the tack of the way we do business as usual, I suppose. Let me read you one more, maybe two, we'll see how far we get. This is from Barb Bourne. And this is interesting. This is very much an Ex Corde type question that has grown up in 30 years at minimum, probably longer. And here's what Barb says. This is Barb. It has been interesting to note the USCCB has aligned with higher ed institutions, Augustine Institute, Franciscan University of Steubenville, that have a very definitive view of truth and seems unwilling to dialogue in formulating the USCCB 3-year Eucharistic Revival and new Catechetical Institute. Could you discuss the impact this will have on the American church long term? How do you think about a question like that? That's what I'm asking. How do you receive Barb's question, panel? Joe, are you speaking or no? You're not? No. Okay. People don't want to touch these questions?
I don't know. I think I don't feel comfortable like talking about institutions I don't know very well and what their conception of truth is. I mean, I have preconceived notions, at least of one of these universities, but I really don't know it well enough to give a fair answer. So
it's very wise, Andrew. I think what we're pointing to is probably that there's a self-evident reality that there is polarization in this country, and there's polarization in the church and in the states, right? So, and we do know that the bishops are meeting in November, and they're going to speak about this Eucharistic document. There's a lot going on. So I wonder, we live there, right? It's our job to comment on these things, but I'll table that because it's, it's neither here nor there for this group.
I can maybe say something really quick.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe. Yeah, then Joe, then Naomi, thanks.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think, and again, I'm with Andrew too, that I don't feel fully equipped to comment on Barb's entire question, but I think the idea of a very definitive view of truth, I mean, I think that that's part of what we need to be doing as a university, is grappling with truths, grappling what the implication of those truths are. And I think this is what I was trying to point at in my presentation, but I think it goes beyond dialogue between science and religion, is being open to new understandings of what truths are, but also walking the line and not slipping into some kind of easy relativism. And that's the hard work of the intellectual life, is holding fast to truths that we believe in. And at the same time, not being so dogmatic in those truths that we can't be open to seeing new perspectives and new ways of thinking about them. So I don't know if that addresses Barb's question exactly, but that would be the sort of the thing that I would want to say in the adjacency to the question.
Yeah, and if I might jump in, I mean, I think that that is absolutely crucial, that when we're talking about dialogue, when we're talking about intellectual humility, dialogue requires that we be clear about what we believe, that we not be wishy-washy, and that we stake out a position. So we can't be, we can't hold our beliefs tentatively. We can't, act as if, we might just be blown over by the next wind of change. We have a unique vision to offer to the world, and we are doing ourselves a disservice. We are doing the world a disservice if we sort of, just sort of tentatively throw out things that we think people will like. That's a bad idea. And I think, in that we also have to be concerned about maintaining our own identity. So there's a question here that hasn't been asked by John Breen, and he asked about faculty hiring at a Catholic institution. And I think we should be clear that there are some things that are out of bounds at a Catholic institution, that we do not want to hire people who, for instance, advocate for white supremacy in their published writings. That would be inimical to the mission of the university. Similarly, we do not want people who advocate for so-called abortion rights in their published writings. That would be inimical to the mission of the university. And so we have to be absolutely clear about who we are, and our public witness is, it's not, so yes, be humble, communicate with people, include everyone in the community, be open, but not in a way where we are sort of, attenuating our own distinctive voice or refusing to say the things that we actually believe.
There's a G.K. Chesterton quote that might be appropriate here, as G.K. Chesterton quotes tend to be. And he's got this quote where he says, the purpose of an open mind is like that of an open mouth. Its end is to close itself again on something solid. And I think that sort of echoes this tension that Naomi was raising of, do we want to dialogue? Absolutely. But I think we also need to be very clear about what we believe and what we stand for. And that just a purely open mind is also a vice. And that's part of intellectual humility, is where realizing where we keep our minds open and where we do close them again on something solid.
Joe, that'll be the last word. It's clear to me we're just getting warmed up. There's much more here, and this time has gone by so quickly. So I want to thank everybody, but I want to hand it back over to Dr. Margaret Callahan, our provost, for the official goodbye. Hi, Margaret.
This has been a fascinating discussion of the approaches to teaching and research to frame Catholic higher education in the 21st century. It's a reminder of continual conversation between religion and science, in which they are not mutually exclusive, but rather inform and enrich the other in the search for truth. This itself embodies Catholic intellectual heritage. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, faculty, staff, students, alumni, and friends. You are a very important part of our mission, and we're appreciative that you were with us. I'd like to especially thank our faculty panelists and our student panelists. I just have to say I'm in awe of the conversation and the comments that you made. I think you gave us all so much to think about. So I thank you. I invite you all to join us for our next 150th Scholars event, Tuesday, November 11th, when leading scholars from around the world discuss complex issues of climate change, economics, and human rights that drive global migration. So we hope you will all join us again. Good afternoon, and please stay engaged, stay safe, and be healthy. Thank you.